Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here for the IB Virtual Conference. My name is Christopher Green, and today I'm going to be looking at developing intercultural competencies through theory of knowledge. I have a little presentation for you all, and I hope that you enjoy it. And I look forward to hearing some of your responses in regards to what I have to talk about and what I have to say today. So, a little bit of history about myself. I am a workshop leader and a school verification visit team member for the IB. I'm also an author of language and literature textbooks. I've been a writer for the Times Educational Supplement, The Voice newspaper in the UK, and the International School Parent magazine. I'm a researcher, and I've also done a podcast for the Equal Group, where we're looking at ideas in terms of interculturalism and looking at ideas such as multiculturalism. Now, regarding developing intercultural competencies through theory of knowledge, there's been basically an increase in diplomatic relations, multinational corporations, and military movements, and globalization in general. And this has seen a rapid rise in the amount of international schools around the world. Currently, I believe there are 8,000 international schools globally. But what does this idea of international mean? From a historical perspective, an international education meant promoting ideas coming from predominantly one part of the world. And most of the time, it seemed from a Western perspective. Western educators purporting their ideologies to the world and the rest of the student body, which was highly international. The method seemed to either have a bilingual initiative or a program that focused on westernized cultures so that students were prepared for the international world that they could face afterwards. However, our mission as IB educators should be a call for mutual understanding and for mutual understanding of international needs and interculturalism. So be it in terms of multicultural, intercultural understanding, competence or dialogue, this needs to permeate the content and the everyday learning that happens in our classrooms. Authentic international education should want to help create a better and more peaceful world through intercultural understanding and respect. But how do we enable this to happen in the context of a school or in the context of an environment where most stakeholders have taken the risk of being part of an international community in the first place in an increasingly nationalistic and hostile environment? Well, one way we can do that is exploring it through the core. And the core functions within TOK is to understand about the knower and the knowledge of the knower and how they interact with the world around them. So we've seen the idea of the iceberg before, and the iceberg obviously has a visible tip. Many of us have heard of the cultural iceberg model, but how many of us actually practice it in our everyday teaching? And how do we develop students to develop an awareness of this? And what is below the tip is more important, obviously. The tip represents areas of culture that we can see manifest in the physical sense. In addition, more often than not, these elements that we come into contact with first when diving into new culture or country. And such visual elements include things such as music, dress, dance, architecture, language, food, gestures, greetings, etc., behaviors, devotional practices, art, and more. In addition, it can also relate to behaviors such as seeing people ignoring red traffic lights or spitting on the floor or smoking in public or laughing at different jokes to our own. All depending on your own culture, these things may come across as weird, strange, rude, ignorant, or simply silly. But none of the visual elements can ever make real sense without understanding the drivers behind them. And these are the hidden elements at the bottom of the iceberg. The invisible side, which is larger, arguably more important. It is these invisible elements that are the underlying causes of what manifests on the visible side. So, when thinking about culture, the bottom side of the iceberg will include things such as religious beliefs, worldviews, rules on relationships, approach to family, motivations, tolerance for change, attitudes to rules, communication styles, modes of thinking, effort with risk, the difference between public and private, gender differences, and more. And what seems very interesting is that what on the underside of the iceberg, that seems to reflect a lot of what the IB profile is seeking in our learners and in our educators. So that should be primarily what we're trying to tackle and trying to look at. And I think we can look at that within the theory of knowledge. So this is from underneath. This is an image of a diver and a jellyfish underneath an iceberg. And although it's a wonderful image, but it's also a lot of symbolism to it. The whole idea of developing intercultural knowledge is to explore beyond the tip of the iceberg when it comes to understanding people and their traditions and cultures. By looking beyond the surface, we are able to dig deeper and gain further understanding of how to interact with each other. Intercultural competence, therefore, is the ability to communicate effectively and appropriately with people who are linguistically and culturally different to ourselves. So, this is a model from the Monash, and I found it very, very apt in terms of defining intercultural competence. What are intercultural competencies, we might ask? So intercultural competence is the ability to function effectively across cultures, to think and act appropriately, and to communicate work with people from different cultural backgrounds. Intercultural competence is a value asset in an increasingly globalized world. We are most likely to interact with people from different cultures and countries who have been shaped through different values, beliefs, and experiences from us. One of the things that UNESCO wants to really establish is this aim of intercultural education and learning, which fits with the IB's ideas also. Understanding of different cultural groups and knowledge, which is declarative, procedural, and strategic. We must respect different cultural groups and attitudes based on feelings, beliefs, and opinions. And this will increase a dialogue between cultural groups, and we also need to apply the skills, and we need to apply that knowledge and also produce the knowledge. So I think the theory of knowledge is very important in terms of developing intercultural competence. So there are some aspects that we all need to look at in terms of developing this idea of intercultural competence. Now, I won't go too far in terms of talking about the diagram, but there are obviously three main things: knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And because we're talking about theory of knowledge, I feel that having cultural self-awareness, cultural specific knowledge, and social linguistic awareness, and a grasp of global issues and trends can be definitely incorporated within our teaching of theory of knowledge. So we can look at the core theme and the idea of the knowledge and the knower. If you think about ourselves as knowers, and if you think about our students in this position, we really need to help them to try and establish that it's not only about them, but about the world around them. So the core theme, the knowledge and knower, provides an opportunity for our students to reflect on what shapes their perspective as a knower, where their values come from, and how they make sense of and navigate the world around them. Importantly, this theme does not focus exclusively on the individual knower. It also considers aspects such as the impact of different communities of knowers to which we belong. Knowledge questions from the core theme that could help develop cultural notions might come from every compulsory part of the TOK curriculum as described. For example, scope: what criteria can we use to distinguish between knowledge, belief and opinion, perspectives? How do empathy and imagination help us to understand other perspectives? Methods and tools: what are the advantages and disadvantages of requiring that all knowledge is verified by a group? And ethics: as knowers, do we have a moral duty to examine our own assumptions and biases? And I think ethics here is a very important aspect as well. So in class, for example, these questions could be distributed in small groups to discuss by students, and they could reflect on them individually through apps such as OneNote or ClassNote, or they could do it through Microsoft Flipgrid, where they could communicate their own opinions, and then they could also have a class group discussion as well. So you don't always have to just expose students and just put the questions out there in class. They can also have time to cerebrate and think about them later on. Another thing that could be looked at within theory of knowledge is the whole idea of epistemology and different types of epistemology. So one way to expand the idea that there are communities of knowers is to also look at different cultural views regarding epistemology itself. If we look at relational epistemology, epistemology obviously refers to the study of knowledge and how we know what we know, how do things exist, etc. But we need to think about the whole idea of knowing and being. And in Eastern philosophy, knowing and being comes from it being environment focused, relational, and situated. Our identities are mainly focused on the idea of the group. And again, our identity is made predominantly within society, not from ourselves. We get this from our families, our religion, and the community we're in. So in a sense, we can think about this idea, this Eastern philosophy of being a kind of rhizomatic system. How do I acquire knowledge through senses, intuition, emotion, interaction, and experience? How do we know what we know subjectively in ways that can only be verified according to the context or situation from multiple perspectives? And I think it's important for students to acknowledge both Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy, because I think it will enhance their understanding and motivation towards the subject. If we just keep it towards Western philosophy, which is in the next slide, I think it limits their acquisition of knowledge and their production of knowledge and their enjoyment of the subject itself. So as you can see, in Western philosophy, it is our identities come from our hierarchical understanding. Rather, our knowing and being comes from an object-focused, binary and hierarchical structure. The identities usually focus on the self. I think, therefore I am, and it's usually self-made, individually constructed. But again, we get this idea of culture coming from the same aspects: family, religion, and community. So how can we categorize knowledge within the Western philosophy? How do I acquire knowledge? Through senses, reason, and emotion. How do we know what we know? Perhaps through Western science, in ways that can be objectively measured and verified. So now we have these marrying of these two philosophical ideas. We maybe have a greater understanding and enjoyment and motivation in the subject, and in other subjects too. So in terms of ways of knowing, I tried to break them down and think about how the ways of knowing could be a combination of both Western and Eastern. Culturals and biases, there's boundaries within which an individual operates in order to feel a sense of belonging to a society or a group. And I think this comes with empathy. And empathy is the imaginary participation in another person's experience, including emotional and intellectual dimensions, by imagining his or her perspective and not assuming the other person's position. This will help us have a greater understanding. The intercultural experience, the experience of an interaction with individual groups or people whose culture is different from your own, is greatly beneficial, in my opinion. And then we can have a better understanding about the intercultural or cultural differences with our culture or cultures and theirs. We can have an understanding of the differences of their rules and behaviors and communication through language and reason, through the verbal and non-verbal ways. And in terms of intuition and memory, we have this self-awareness, which will help us perhaps suspend judgment in valuing interactions with people who are culturally different from others, from ourselves rather. We can postpone assessment and evaluation because we can use empathy and imagination to realize, actually, wait, that isn't something I would like to feel either. And then with intuition and memory, we can sort of feel a way of that we can disconnect from the process of automatic judgment that perhaps sense perception brings. But in a good way, sense perception and faith can bring curiosity and openness, and can promote a worldview that's through a cognitive and affective lens, through which we can construe our own experiences and make sense of the world around us. And that only comes with experience. But I think that this marries, these ideas marry with the IB learner profile, and you can definitely break down these ideas or these ways of knowing and connect them to intercultural competencies to help your students, in a sense, compartmentalize and understand how intercultural competencies can enable them and enhance their knowledge. So one of the ideas I thought about was the idea of knowledge and technology, how you can use an example with there. If we're looking at the idea of knowledge and technology, we have lots of things to look at in terms of how intercultural competencies are necessary within the massive thing that is the World Wide Web. So one question we could look at is perspectives. Do social networks reinforce our existing perspective rather than boosting our engagement with diverse perspectives? With things such as algorithms that are trained to advertise and sell us things that we want, or that they think we want, or that are connected to our interests, there's a sense that there's a confirmation bias and it creates an echo chamber. And with that echo chamber, people will consume and read literature that is completely different than perhaps the person sitting right next to them. An example could be the US political landscape, pretty much, which creates polarization due to the social media posts and due to what you engage with in online. The main idea for these social media companies and these social media platforms is to increase engagement, and as long as they keep you online, you're going to stay online and you're going to consume the media that they are presenting to you, and also you're going to click on the adverts that they gear towards you also. So things such as hate speech, which is another area to look at in terms of ethics, that can kind of be lost. It can appear as hate speech to someone else, but because it's been reinforced, your ideas are being reinforced, you may not view it as hate speech. So content that promotes outrage, deception, and conspiracy is promoted as a tool here to drive more engagement. And in the end, it's all for profit. Stronger ideological tensions make cooperation and compromise increasingly difficult and can affect democratic processes, including discussions within classes in theory of knowledge. So we really need to make sure that students are aware of how they're being, in a sense, manipulated. So this question, I think, is a very useful one. You could use some examples, some real life situations for this. So for instance, looking at the option of knowledge and technology, we can look at bias and machine-based learning. Now, a real life situation could be Google's inclusive images. So though not data bias in a traditional sense, racial bias still warrants mentioning due to its prevalence in artificial intelligence machine learning of late. Racial bias occurs when data skews in favor of particular demographics and in favor of particular cultures. This can be seen in recognition, facial recognition programs, and automatic speech recognition technology, which fails to recognize people who are perhaps non-white as accurately as it does Caucasians. Google's inclusive images competition included good examples of how this can occur and how they are trying to tackle it. For example, if you do a specific search, the idea of weddings and ceremonies and brides and grooms, certain religious festivals or religious ways of doing a wedding would turn up, and they were predominantly Western and predominantly featured white couples in a very Christian format. However, that might not be the case for the billions of people who live on this planet. So therefore, they're not recognizing themselves in their own searches. And machines being built by what seems to be a very small amount of people, this can create racial bias. And is it possible for algorithms to be objective when they're written by humans, mostly upper class white American males in Silicon Valley, who are shaped by their own biases and experiences? And this is a question that you can talk about and look at with your students. You know, the release of large publicly available image data sets, such as ImageNet or Open Images, has been one of the factors driving the tremendous progress in the field of computer vision. While these data sets are a necessary and critical part of developing useful machine learning, they've been based, it's interesting to think about where the photos are collected from, because the shape of the data set informs what a machine learning model learns and can such skew the research community to inadvertently develop models that may perform less well on images drawn from geographical regions that are underrepresented within that open image database. So that's an interesting area you could look at in terms of options and knowledge and technology. Furthermore, a US government study, for example, in terms of Amazon's recognition, artificial intelligence, and IBM system that's used for law enforcement, there is a US government study, and it suggests that facial recognition algorithms are far less accurate at identifying African Americans and Asian faces compared to Caucasian faces. African American females were even more likely to be misidentified, it indicated. So tech giants such as IBM, they stopped offering on ethical grounds and on economic grounds of human sciences, this mass surveillance or racial profiling for law enforcement. This idea, or this real life situation, could offer numerous ethical and natural science discussions within your classroom. And I'm sure that the option of knowledge technology does present relevancy for students who also probably felt this and seen this and encountered this situation themselves. So one thing we could look at is the arts as well. And we could think about how important is language in identifying a society's identity. How can art change the way we interpret the world? If the language of an art form is nonverbal, does this free it from being limited to propositional knowledge? One of the videos that I sometimes like to present in my class for language and literature and for TOK is a video where these two linguists go around the world trying to save dying languages. And I think it's very interesting looking at the first question in that regard. It's called Linguists. Two American doctors of linguistics go around the world, and they try and save a language called Chulam in Siberia. And they realize that that language is being interfered with, in a sense, or invaded by another language, and it's actually destroying the identity of those people. Can art change the way we interpret the world? I thought was an interesting idea too, because you can consume art that is faith-based, that is based from rigid ideas within religion, or you can look at art within, for example, street art, which can challenge ideas and can present irony and can challenge your own ideas, your own perceptions of what different cultures are. If language of art is non-verbal, does this free it from being limited to propositional knowledge? One example I'd like to look at is the idea of that one of the discussions could be based on arts and culture, but one of the things I like to look at is Sean Tan's book, The Arrival. So we can explore art forms and artworks that are strongly rooted in a particular cultural tradition, as well as reflecting on the diversity of arts across time, cultures, and contexts. Students could also explore outsider art as a way to stimulate conversation about the potential for art and challenge established values. As aforementioned, The Arrival by Sean Tan, it's a graphic novel that reveals an appreciation of multiculturalism via stunning illustration and storytelling without words that can transport learners to other worlds and democratize the classroom. Now, if the language of an art form is non-verbal, does it free it from being limited to propositional knowledge? How do we know when we're reading a graphic novel without words? For instance, in this image here, we have this wonderful idea where we can look at context, experience, and intuition. From the context, we understand that perhaps this person is a traveler. And from experience, we know that he's trying to write to someone else. And from intuition, we can perhaps decipher perhaps what this language or this code means. Because we've seen these types of words before, or letters before, but they're not quite our own language. I just think it's a very interesting idea to open up discussion for people who are perhaps less confident, or for people who are less able in the subjects, to really explore it through imagery. And one of the things I thought about in terms of the theory of knowledge and incorporating it within your own subjects, such as literature, is that reading literature beyond us, culturally and politically, sparks debate and in our class and beyond. It owns critical thinking, heightens our social skills, and encourages empathy. Reading literature which features multicultural groups is a powerful strategy to reduce stigmatization and out-group, in-group mentalities. Some critics argue that children don't necessarily need to see themselves reflected in literature, as long as the characters are believable and the story is true. It's true, of course, that good literature reaches across cultures and borders to touch us all in terms of the human condition. However, some children might also feel historically that they've never seen themselves within the text, or worse, ridiculed within children's books themselves. So if they see themselves visually and textually as realistically human, it'd be essential in them understanding the world in a more coherent manner. And one of the two texts that I've looked at was the idea of Persepolis, which talks about the Iranian Revolution, and Blue is the Warmest Color, which is, they're both books that are written in French, and I'm an English teacher. And Blue is the Warmest Color looks at the subculture of lesbian youth within France. Now, one of the other ideas, this is an important issue to look at, as it focuses on the idea of knowledge in indigenous societies, which is one of the options. I feel it's important because there's an idea that the world you're born in is just one model of reality. Other cultures are not failed attempts at being you, they're unique manifestations of you and you again and again. And just thinking about some of the questions that are found within the guide, is it possible to have knowledge of a culture in which we've not been raised? To what extent are we aware of the impact of our culture and what we believe and know? Also, what does the term indigenous actually mean? Is it loaded? Does it come from a study of anthropology or enhance our intercultural competencies? Are we not all indigenous? There's a brilliant TED talk which explores this idea, and it's from a gentleman called Wade Davis. He's an explorer from National Geographic, which is quite a lucky role. And he looks at this extraordinary diversity that's found within the world, and how it's disappearing at an alarming rate because of things like hegemony and ethnocentrism. And we need to be made more aware of these ideas that like in terms of the linguists, culture is also being eroded due to globalization. We are part of that. But how can we help appreciate and share mutual respect for those who don't always need to be trawling all over the world, who have been actually hunter-gatherers, who have been functioning within their own societies? And do we always need to think about us being the salvation to these types of people? I don't think so at all. And I think if we have an awareness of how their knowledge and how their ideas are presented in an equal manner to our own, or in this IB world, then I think we have we'll have a better understanding for it and we'll become richer for it. One of the interesting ideas and interesting questions I felt as well was in knowledge and religion, which is another option. It says, do we have an ethical responsibility to gain knowledge of different religions to help us better understand the world and those around us? Can there be a religious knowledge that is independent of culture that produces it? Recent situations show that the rights and cultural minorities, the rights of religious and cultural minorities are in decline. And although this world is becoming more scientifically focused, we need to also acknowledge that religion has been a strong foundation for how people understand the world. Definitions of cultural competence often refer to the need to be aware and attentive to the religious and spiritual needs and orientations. However, there are many papers, for example, one by Rob Whiteley in his paper at the US National Library of Medicine, which say that subjects such as psychiatry, they maintain an ambivalent attitude to the incorporation of religion and spirituality into psychiatric practice. This despite the fact that many patients, especially those from underprivileged or under-reserved backgrounds or minority backgrounds, are devoted wholeheartedly to religious and faith-based systems and find much solace and support in their religiosity. So intercultural communication encounters can be impacted by religion because of religious belief and practice. And it's one of the major cultural differences that we share. Religion can be manifested in beliefs, practices, traditions, and customs. And so therefore, using the option of knowledge and religion within TOK, I don't think it's something to shy away from. I think it's something to fully embrace, to realize that there are a lot of people who make a lot of decisions based on religion. So lastly, in my final conclusion, I believe that exploring multicultural angles opens up new worlds. The intention is a consequence that students can explore the core by realizing that their identities and how they produce and acquire knowledge is from a variety of sources and a variety of peoples. The single story, as Chimamanda mentions a lot, creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is that not only are they untrue, but they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And I feel that obviously will hinder our progress and enjoyment and motivation of theory of knowledge, hence why we should incorporate intercultural competencies within the core program. Thank you very much. I'm open to share resources and further develop my own bank of real life situations to help push forward the notions of intercultural competencies and to help our students and to help ourselves so we can make a peaceful and better world. Thank you very much.